When Spartacus, a slave gladiator, raised his fist against the Roman Empire, he challenged the authority of seasoned and powerful generals. But how was it possible that the world's most feared army stumbled repeatedly in the face of a rebellion led by a former slave? The fatal mistakes of these commanders not only cost the lives of thousands, but almost shook the foundations of Rome. You might think that Rome's military superiority would have crushed Spartacus in a matter of weeks. But what if I told you that the strategic failures and arrogance of its generals threw Rome into one of the most humiliating conflicts in its history? Misjudged decisions, underestimating the enemy, and unexpected resistance shaped the course of this uprising. What really went wrong? How did Rome's top commanders get outsmarted by a gladiator? Today we're going to dive into the strategies and mistakes of these generals who, by a thread, nearly brought down the empire. What you're about to discover will change the way you see this famous rebellion. Get ready, because what's coming next reveals the secrets behind Rome's defeat at the hands of Spartacus. Let's begin. Amid the chaos of Roman arenas, Spartacus, a Thracian forced to fight as a gladiator, saw an opportunity that many other slaves and gladiators thought was impossible. He not only managed to escape, but also gathered a group of gladiators willing to follow his dream of freedom. The crucial point of this uprising wasn't just the escape, but the audacity to confront the Roman Empire head-on. It was unthinkable that a man born into slavery would dare to challenge the world's greatest military power. But Spartacus wasn't alone. The group of gladiators who followed him were men who knew death up close, ready to fight to their last breath. While the Romans initially saw the uprising as a small disturbance, Spartacus and his followers began to organize in an impressive way. They weren't just a band of desperate fugitives, but an army with a clear objective: resist oppression and fight for freedom. Their early victories over small Roman garrisons were shocking to the Roman elite, who still believed they could easily contain them. However, these victories strengthened the gladiators and inspired other slaves to join the cause, expanding the movement and further challenging Rome's social and military structure. The empire, though vast and powerful, wasn't prepared for an uprising of this scale. The organization of the gladiators grew rapidly, and Spartacus, despite lacking formal military training, showed a natural talent for leadership and military strategy. He knew the terrain, understood the mindset of his enemies, and above all, knew how to keep his men motivated. Each victory reinforced the hope that they could actually achieve the impossible: freedom from an empire built on slavery. Spartacus's audacity was not only military, but also symbolic. He became the face of a resistance that symbolized the fight against oppression. His followers didn't just see him as a military leader, but as a symbol of hope, a man who defied the fate that had been imposed on them. And this, more than any tactical plan, was what made Spartacus a real threat to the empire. He was creating an idea, and ideas are hard to defeat, especially when fueled by desperation and the will to survive. This movement, which began with gladiators armed with makeshift swords, would soon turn into a full-blown war against Rome. Spartacus and his men's escape from the training camp in Capua marked the beginning of a conflict that would surprise and humiliate Rome's greatest generals. What started as an isolated revolt was about to become one of the most significant uprisings in Roman history, forcing Roman commanders to act with a sense of urgency they had never imagined. Clodius Glaber, the first Roman commander sent to confront Spartacus, severely underestimated the adversary he faced. Tasked with quickly suppressing the uprising, Glaber saw the mission as a simple operation, believing that a disorganized group of gladiators would be no match for the disciplined Roman army. He relied on the numerical superiority of his troops, as well as the supposed lack of strategy on the enemy's part. However, what Glaber didn't foresee was Spartacus's ability to turn the numerical disadvantage into a strength. Using guerrilla tactics and exploiting his knowledge of the terrain, Spartacus took Glaber's troops by surprise. Glaber's strategy was lazy and arrogant from the start. He believed he could simply surround Spartacus and his men on Mount Vesuvius, waiting for hunger and desperation to force them to surrender. However, the gladiator had other plans. Spartacus not only broke the siege, but did so in a way that humiliated the Roman commander. Using improvised ropes made from vines, he led his men down a steep descent on the side of the volcano, surprising Glaber's forces and crushing their defensive line. The victory was devastating for the Romans, who not only lost men and resources, but also suffered a blow to their confidence. Glaber's defeat exposed a fundamental weakness in the Romans' approach. They saw Spartacus and his men as nothing more than escaped slaves, incapable of posing a real military threat. Glaber, in particular, believed that the mere presence of his army would be enough to intimidate them into submission. But what he didn't understand was that Spartacus was fighting with something far more powerful than fear: the desire for freedom. While the Romans fought out of duty and for the glory of the empire, Spartacus's men were fighting for their lives, and that difference in motivation was crucial. Glaber's defeat was also a wake-up call for Rome. For the first time, the city realized that Spartacus's rebellion was more than just a simple slave uprising. The tactical skill and inspiring leadership of the Thracian gladiator indicated that this conflict was far from being resolved quickly. Yet, instead of learning from Glaber's mistakes, the next Roman commanders would repeat the same errors, believing they could crush the revolt with numbers and brute force, never fully grasping the true nature of the enemy they faced. With Glaber's fall, Spartacus grew even stronger, attracting new followers and solidifying his position. The victory not only cemented his leadership, but also gave his cause a legitimacy that had once seemed impossible. Now, the Romans were truly at war with a gladiator, and this war was just beginning. After Clodius Glaber's humiliating defeat, Rome appointed Publius Varinius to suppress the growing Spartacus rebellion. Confident in his military experience and Roman discipline, Varinius believed he could easily end the insurrection. However, like Glaber, he underestimated his enemy. As Spartacus expanded his forces, he developed an army that was not only numerically superior, but also more experienced and fearless. While Varinius focused on moving his heavy troops and positioning them in traditional formations, Spartacus used the mobility of his men, exploiting the terrain and launching fast and precise attacks. Varinius bet on a direct offensive against Spartacus, but his strategy was far too predictable for the gladiator, who had already learned how to exploit the rigidity of Roman formations. Instead of confronting the enemy head-on, Spartacus split his forces, attacking the most vulnerable points of Varinius' troops. He used attrition tactics, wearing down the Roman army with small attacks and ambushes, completely disorienting the commander. Varinius found himself cornered by an enemy he didn't understand, and what began as an attempt to annihilate the rebellion quickly turned into a battle for survival. As Spartacus continued to maneuver with intelligence, Varinius made the mistake of not adapting his strategy. He insisted on using conventional tactics, believing that sooner or later his military superiority would prevail. However, this approach only magnified Glaber's mistakes. Varinius ignored the lessons learned by his predecessor and fell into the same traps. His men, demoralized and exhausted, began to desert, and the psychological siege Spartacus imposed on the Roman army was clear. It wasn't just about defeating the gladiators. It was about dealing with an enemy who knew how to play with the minds of his adversaries. Varinius' defeat was even more humiliating than Glaber's. As the Roman army disintegrated, Spartacus and his men moved with renewed confidence. Publius Varinius, unable to stop the gladiators' advance, was forced to retreat, abandoning weapons, standards, and a large quantity of supplies. The image of Rome as an invincible empire was beginning to crumble. With each victory of Spartacus, the myth of Roman military superiority was challenged, and chaos started to spread among the legions. This defeat was a turning point. Rome, which had dealt with revolts and insurgencies in the past, was beginning to realize that Spartacus was not just a charismatic leader, but a strategist of exceptional talent. His ability to use his opponent's mistakes to his advantage and the way he mastered psychological warfare stood out. Publius Varinius, in turn, would become another name on the list of generals who failed to contain a slave. His defeat, like Glaber's, was a lesson Rome couldn't seem to learn. With Verinius defeated and Spartacus' rebellion growing at an alarming rate, Rome turned to Gaius Cassius Longinus, the proconsul of Cisalpine Gaul, to try to put an end to the conflict. Cassius was an experienced commander, and with his army stationed in the north of the peninsula, he was in a strategic position to intercept Spartacus. Unlike his predecessors, Cassius tried to avoid underestimating the enemy, bringing a considerable force and taking a more cautious approach. He believed that a proper siege and cutting off supplies would be enough to crush the rebels. However, Spartacus had already proven to be an unpredictable adversary. Cassius' attempt to block Spartacus to the north failed for one simple reason. The gladiator was a master of breaking expectations. While Cassius prepared his troops for a direct confrontation, Spartacus, instead of advancing, temporarily retreated, confusing the Romans. By reorganizing his forces and opting for a flanking movement, Spartacus once again managed to avoid facing the enemy at a disadvantage, ambushing small parts of Cassius' army and isolating his detachments. Cassius, who expected an open field attack, was surprised by Spartacus' ability to fragment his forces. Cassius' biggest mistake was believing that he could force Spartacus into fighting on unfavorable terms. Spartacus, however, mastered the art of avoiding direct battles when the odds weren't in his favor. He exploited the patience of Roman commanders, making them wait for a battle that never came, while his men grew stronger and their morale increased. This psychological war of attrition drained Cassius' forces both physically and mentally. The inability to force Spartacus into a direct confrontation undermined the confidence of the legions, once again showing the vulnerability of Rome against an enemy they couldn't predict. Cassius' campaign ended in complete failure. Despite having a large army and the experience of a veteran commander, he was outmaneuvered by a former slave who, with guerrilla tactics, continued to inflict considerable losses on the Roman army. What should have been an easy victory turned into a series of ambushes and unexpected attacks that left Cassius' troops demoralized. The disorganized retreat of his forces was another stain on Rome's military reputation, and Spartacus emerged from this confrontation even stronger and more feared. After Cassius' defeat, the crisis within Rome intensified. It wasn't just the loss of men and resources that worried the senators and Roman people, but the psychological impact of seeing successive generals fail against a group of revolting slaves. Spartacus' rebellion was no longer seen as a simple insurrection. It had become a war that threatened the very authority of the Roman Empire. When Marcus Licinius Crassus was assigned to put an end to the Spartacus rebellion, Rome had already suffered humiliating defeats and was desperate for a decisive victory. Crassus, known for his immense wealth and ambition, saw this mission not only as an opportunity to save the empire, but also to consolidate his power and prestige. Unlike the previous commanders, he had a clear understanding of the gravity of the situation and did not underestimate Spartacus. Crassus brought a disciplined military approach, reintroducing the brutal practice of decimation, executing 1 out of every 10 soldiers who deserted or failed in battle, to restore discipline within his legions. Crassus' strategy was ruthless. He knew that defeating Spartacus required more than sheer numbers, so he opted for a combination of siege and pursuit. Crassus built a line of fortifications to trap Spartacus and his forces in southern Italy, cutting off their supplies and undermining their morale. Though Spartacus was a master at breaking sieges and ambushing enemies, Crassus had a disciplined army ready for a prolonged confrontation. This military patience started to work in favor of the Romans. Even so, Spartacus continued to surprise with his ability to improvise and react quickly to Roman maneuvers. Despite his effective tactics, Crassus faced constant pressure to produce quick results. The Senate, growing increasingly anxious, considered sending Pompey, an equally ambitious general, to assist in the campaign. This motivated Crassus to intensify his offensive, determined to claim the glory of victory before it could be shared. He pursued Spartacus with relentless persistence, forcing him to fight under increasingly difficult conditions. With dwindling resources and his men weary after months of skirmishes, Spartacus faced his greatest challenge yet. fighting a general who understood his cunning and was prepared to respond with equal brutality. Crassus finally managed to corner Spartacus in a decisive battle at the river Salaris. The gladiators, starving and weakened, fought bravely, but Crassus' army held the upper hand in both numbers and morale. Spartacus, determined not to be captured, personally led a fierce charge against the Roman ranks, hoping to kill Crassus and turn the tide. However, the effort was in vain. Although the gladiator temporarily broke through enemy lines, he was surrounded and killed in battle, along with thousands of his men. Crassus' victory marked the end of the rebellion, but it left deep scars on Roman pride. With Spartacus' defeat, Crassus restored order, but the victory was bittersweet. Many believe that Crassus did not receive full credit for defeating the gladiator, as Pompey, returning from his campaigns in Spain, destroyed the last remnants of Spartacus' forces and rushed to claim part of the glory. Even so, the victory cemented Crassus as one of the most powerful men in Rome. His campaign against Spartacus would be remembered not just as a military victory, but as a testament to the complexities and challenges Rome faced in combating the internal threat led by a former slave. The final battle between Crassus' forces and Spartacus unfolded in an atmosphere of tension and desperation. Spartacus, with his men exhausted and no escape options, knew the confrontation was inevitable. He had tried to negotiate an exit, supposedly seeking a passage out of Italy, but Crassus' legions had blocked his escape routes. Faced with no way out, Spartacus decided to fight to the end. He gathered his men and prepared them for a battle that many knew was suicidal, but his determination was unshakable. They would not fight for victory that day. They would fight for the honor and freedom they had long sought. Crassus, on the other hand, was determined to end the rebellion once and for all. He knew that Spartacus was still a formidable leader, capable of inspiring his men to extraordinary feats, and he could not afford any more mistakes. So, he meticulously prepared his legions, positioning them in a formation that would prevent any attempt by the rebels to flee. The Roman numerical superiority was overwhelming, but Crassus was not willing to take any risks. He wanted a complete victory, leaving no survivors who might reignite the flames of revolt. Spartacus, however, was ready to die with his weapons in hand. The battlefield at the river Salaris became the scene of a brutal fight. Spartacus led his men from the front lines, a gesture that inspired his followers and struck fear into the Romans. He knew that killing Crassus was his only chance to turn the tide, and so he tried to break through the enemy lines towards the Roman commander. In a desperate confrontation, Spartacus fought with legendary ferocity, killing several legionaries and severely wounding many others. However, his attack, though impressive, was crushed by the impeccable organization of Crassus' troops. The dream of a slave revolution was coming to an end, with Spartacus falling on the battlefield, along with his last soldiers. Spartacus' death was symbolic. Though his body was never found, he became a legend, a symbol of resistance against oppression. Crassus, on the other hand, had his victory cemented. He crucified around 6,000 prisoners along the Appian Way, a brutal display of Roman power and the consequences of defying the empire. The horror of this punishment served as a warning to any other group that dared to rise up against Rome. However, as much as the Romans tried to erase Spartacus' memory, his story survived and inspired future generations. His name would live on forever, while Rome would have to deal with the scars left by this rebellion. The final battle was more than just a military victory for Rome. It was proof that the empire, despite its strength, had vulnerabilities. Crassus may have been the man who defeated Spartacus, but Rome's failures throughout the revolt left a mark that would never be forgotten. Spartacus' rebellion exposed the social tensions and weaknesses within the very system that upheld the empire. While Crassus emerged victorious, the cost of that victory would be felt by Rome for years to come. The revolt led by Spartacus left deep scars on Rome, not only in the military sphere, but also in the social and political fabric of the empire. The series of defeats suffered by Roman generals exposed a disturbing vulnerability. Rome, despite its highly trained army and vast resources, was unable to effectively handle enemies who didn't follow the traditional rules of war. Spartacus used guerrilla tactics, improvisation, and local knowledge, which completely undermined the rigid and formal approach of the Roman commanders. Each strategic failure by the generals showed how, no matter how disciplined, the Roman army was unprepared to face a force driven by determination and desperation. The Spartacus uprising highlighted Rome's internal tensions, especially regarding its dependence on slave labor. The revolt was not just a military insurrection, but also a cry for freedom from an oppressed class that sustained the empire's economy. The brutal repression that followed, with thousands of slaves crucified along the Appian Way, was a grim reminder of the cost of slavery and the consequences of underestimating those whom Rome considered inferior. Though this display of force crushed the rebellion, it failed to erase the memory of Spartacus and the lingering fear that new uprisings could happen. The military legacy of the revolt was also profound. The generals who repeatedly failed to stop Spartacus served as examples of what not to do in future campaigns. Arrogance, underestimating the enemy, and a lack of adaptation to new combat conditions were painful lessons learned at the cost of countless lives. Over the years, Rome evolved its tactics, becoming better equipped to deal with both internal and external threats. The war against Spartacus, more than any other slave revolt, forced Rome to look inward and reconsider its combat strategies and social control. On the other hand, Spartacus' temporary success showed that Rome was not invincible. Its army, which was supposed to crush any threat with ease, was repeatedly outmaneuvered by a gladiator who started with a small group of slaves. This reality shook the confidence in the Roman legions and raised questions about the effectiveness of their military system, especially in the face of improvised insurgencies. In the long run, the fear of new revolts forced Rome to rethink its policies on slavery and social control. While Spartacus' rebellion was contained, its impact echoed for generations, fueling the myth that even the greatest empire in the world could be challenged. The rebellion also revealed the fragility of political power in Rome. The way Crassus and Pompey competed for final glory after Spartacus' defeat exposed the internal rivalries that were eroding the Senate and the Roman political elite. The competition for credit and prestige wasn't just about pride. It was about power and influence within Rome's political structure. Spartacus, even without intending to, had catalyzed a series of events that intensified the power struggles within the empire itself, setting the stage for future political and military crises that would shake Rome in the years to come.